Today we're going to discover the story of the man who learned to play guitar on a one-stringed ukulele he found in the garbage, who grew up so poor in Seattle that he went to school wearing clothes stitched together by his father from burlap potato sacks, who was told by the United States Army that he was unfit for military service because he was too distracted by his own thoughts, and who in less than 4 years of active performing transformed the electric guitar from a musical instrument into something that had no name before him and has had no real equivalent since. The man who arrived in London in 1966 with nothing but a borrowed amp and a second-hand Fender Stratocaster, and left 2 years later having rearranged every serious musician in England's understanding of what was possible on a fretboard. The man who set his guitar on fire at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, played the American national anthem at Woodstock in 1969 in a way that made 50 years of previous interpretations sound like rough drafts, and died in a London hotel room at 27 years old with a fortune that was already worth tens of millions of dollars and a catalog of music that has never stopped generating revenue. By the time you finish listening to this account of the life of James Marshall Hendrix, you will understand why no single musician in the history of American popular music left a bigger hole when he was gone. Let's begin. James Marshall Hendrix was born on November 27, 1942, at King County Hospital in Seattle, Washington. His father, James Allen Hendrix, known as Al, was 25 years old and serving in the United States Army when his son was born. His mother, Lucille Jeter, was 17. Neither of them was equipped for parenthood, and their marriage was already fracturing under the weight of Al's military service, Lucille's youth, and a poverty so persistent that it defined every aspect of their daily existence. Al returned from the Army in 1945 to find a family he barely knew and a city that offered almost nothing to a young black man without a college degree. He worked odd jobs. He moved the family between apartments in the Central District of Seattle, the predominantly black neighborhood where most African-American families in the city were concentrated by the informal but absolute racial segregation of the post-war Pacific Northwest. Jimmy, as he was called from infancy, grew up in material conditions that in any honest accounting would be described as destitution. There were periods when the family had no working stove and ate cold food for weeks. There were winters when the heat was inconsistent. Al Hendrix was not a cruel father, but he was an absent one in the ways that economic pressure makes men absent even when they are physically present. Lucille was largely gone from Jimmy's daily life by the time he was 8 years old, consumed by the alcohol dependency that would kill her at 32. Jimmy was raised effectively by his paternal grandmother, Nora Hendrix, in a small house on 26th Avenue in the Central District, a woman of enormous personal discipline and quiet warmth who kept the household running on almost nothing. At school, Jimmy was conspicuously unable to sit still in any subject that didn't interest him, and almost nothing interested him except music. He was not diagnosed with anything because diagnostic frameworks for children like him did not exist in Seattle public schools in the early 1950s. He was simply considered difficult, easily distracted, and unlikely to amount to much academically. His teachers were not wrong about the academic trajectory. They were catastrophically wrong about everything else. He found his first guitar equivalent when he was around 11 years old, a one-stringed ukulele that a neighbor was throwing away. He taught himself to play it by watching television, by listening to the radio, by an entirely internal process of figuring out how sound related to hand position that no teacher assigned him and no curriculum prescribed. When Al Hendrix finally bought him a proper acoustic guitar for $5 at a second-hand shop, a moment Al would later describe as one of the most significant of his life, Jimmy slept with it. Literally. He held it in bed at night because he didn't trust that it would still be there in the morning. He was left-handed, but the guitar he had was made for right-handed players. Instead of restringing it, which he couldn't afford, he simply flipped it over and played it upside down, strings running in the reverse direction from what any instruction manual prescribed. This forced him to develop a technique entirely his own, one that no teacher could have taught him because no teacher had ever played that way. The unusual angles, the improvised chord shapes, the unconventional ways his thumb wrapped around the neck, all of these were accidents of poverty and laterality that became the foundations of a playing style that every serious guitarist who came after him would spend decades trying to partially replicate. In 1961, at 18, Jimmy was caught riding in a stolen car, not as the driver, not as the person who had stolen it, but as a passenger. The judge gave him a choice: juvenile detention or military enlistment. Al Hendrix signed the paperwork, and Jimmy went into the United States Army, assigned to the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, one of the most physically demanding and prestigious airborne infantry units in the American military. He completed jump school. He made 26 parachute jumps. He was, by any conventional measure, brave, but he was also absolutely and completely unsuitable for military life. He played guitar during mandatory rest periods. He was caught playing guitar during duty hours. He was reprimanded for falling asleep during briefings because he had stayed up all night playing. His commander eventually wrote in an official evaluation that Private Hendrix had no interest in any activity other than playing his guitar, and that retention was inadvisable. He was honorably discharged in 1962 after 13 months of service. He spent the next 4 years doing something that the music industry histories of this period often compress into a single sentence, but that was in reality an extended education in poverty, persistence, and craft. He played the Chitlin Circuit, the network of black-owned venues across the American South and Midwest, where black musicians could perform during the years of legal segregation. He played backup guitar for Wilson Pickett, for Sam Cooke, for Little Richard, whose traveling review he toured with for months in 1964 and 1965. Little Richard fired him repeatedly for stealing attention from the headliner with his playing and his stage movements. He was hired back repeatedly because replacements who could do what he did not exist. By the time Jimmy arrived in New York City in 1964 and began playing in the clubs of Harlem and Greenwich Village, he had accumulated a playing vocabulary so vast and a stage presence so magnetic that the musicians who encountered him in those settings reacted in ways that are difficult to explain without using superlatives. He was playing at the Café Wah, a basement club on McDougal Street in Greenwich Village, when the former Animals bass player Chaz Chandler saw him in the summer of 1966. Chandler had left the Animals to become a manager and was looking for an artist to build a career around. He watched Jimmy play for 20 minutes and called his partner from a payphone outside the club that same night. He flew Jimmy to London 6 weeks later. London in 1966 was the center of the rock and roll universe. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Who, Cream, the bands that were redefining popular music globally, were all concentrated in a city that was experiencing a cultural explosion unlike anything it had seen since the Victorian age. The musicians who occupied this world were talented, ambitious, and deeply convinced that they represented something new and unprecedented in the history of popular music. Most of them had never seen anyone play guitar the way Jimi Hendrix played guitar, and they were about to. The specific night that the music world has never stopped talking about came just weeks after Jimmy arrived in London in October of 1966. Cream was playing at a small club in Soho, one of the regular London venues where rock musicians would perform unannounced sets between their more official engagements. Eric Clapton was at the absolute height of his London reputation. Clapton is God had been spray-painted on a wall in Islington, and no serious participant in the London music scene contested the assessment. Clapton's control of the electric guitar, his tone, his phrasing, his deep immersion in American blues vocabulary, these had made him, at 21 years old, the most admired guitarist in England and arguably in Europe. Chaz Chandler brought Jimmy to the club that night and asked the promoter to let his new act play a few songs. Clapton, from the stage, saw this unknown American in the audience. He made a gesture toward the stage. He said, according to everyone who was present close enough to hear, something to the effect of, "Come on up then, show me what you've got." It was not aggressively hostile. It was the confident invitation of a man who had played with virtually every guitarist in England and expected to be at least the equal of whoever approached. Jimmy walked to the stage. He picked up his Stratocaster, which he had already begun the practice of flipping upside down to play left-handed. He nodded to the drummer and the bass player. And then he played. The accounts of what happened in the next 15 minutes come from multiple sources who were independently present, and they are consistent in their essentials. The room changed temperature. Musicians who had been talking stopped talking. People who had been standing at the bar turned around. At some point during those 15 minutes, Eric Clapton walked off the stage. Not in anger, not in a visible emotional state of any kind that those nearby could identify. He simply stepped back and to the side and stopped playing. Later, in various interviews across several decades, Clapton described the experience in terms that returned repeatedly to the same central admission. He felt, for the first time in his musical life, that he was watching something he could not do. This moment matters not because of what it reveals about Clapton, whose talent was and remains genuinely enormous, but because of what it reveals about Hendrix. Eric Clapton in 1966 was the standard against which serious electric guitar playing in the English-speaking world was measured. When someone makes that standard feel inadequate, it is not a small thing. It is an arrival. The Jimi Hendrix Experience was formed weeks after that night. Jimi on guitar and lead vocals, Noel Redding on bass, Mitch Mitchell on drums. Their first single, Hey Joe, was released in December 1966 and entered the UK charts immediately. Purple Haze and the Wind Cries. Mary followed in 1967, each reaching the top 10. Are You Experienced, their debut album, was released in May 1967 and sold 200,000 copies in its first month of release in the UK alone. When it was released in the United States in August 1967, it sold over 1 million copies in its first year and eventually went platinum multiple times over. At the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, Jimi Hendrix performed to an American audience that largely did not know who he was. By the end of a 45-minute set that climaxed with him kneeling in front of his amplifier, pouring lighter fluid on his Stratocaster, igniting it, and then smashing the burning instrument on the stage, they knew. The footage of that moment was broadcast on television and shown in cinemas for years afterward. Janis Joplin, watching from the wings, reportedly wept. Pete Townshend of The Who, who had performed earlier that day and had himself smashed his guitar on stage as part of his own theatrical statement, watched Jimi's set from the audience and said afterward that he felt like a plagiarist. The financial consequences of that level of fame accumulated quickly. By 1968, Jimi Hendrix was among the highest-paid performers in the world. His fee for a single concert appearance in the United States had risen from under $1,000 in mid-1966 to between $15,000 and $50,000 per night by 1968, depending on the venue and the promoter. His royalty rates had been renegotiated upward multiple times as it became clear that his albums sold regardless of marketing investment. Electric Ladyland, released in October 1968 as a double album, reached #1 in the United States and the United Kingdom simultaneously, selling over 4 million copies globally in its first year. The royalties generated from that record alone, across the months and years following its release, were in the millions of dollars. In 1968, Jimi began the project that occupied the final creative chapters of his life, the construction of Electric Lady Studios, a recording facility built specifically for him in the basement of a converted venue at 52 West 8th Street in Greenwich Village, New York. The construction cost was originally estimated at $1 million. By the time it was completed in mid-1970, the cost had risen to approximately $2 million. Jimi funded it entirely from his own income. It was the first recording studio ever built by, and for, a rock musician of his generation. Its acoustic design, its recording technology, its philosophy of treating studio time as the musician's creative space, rather than the record label's billing concern, influenced every major personal recording facility built in the subsequent 50 years. Electric Lady Studios still exists at the same address. It remains one of the most sought-after recording locations in the world. By the summer of 1970, Jimi Hendrix's personal wealth was estimated at between $3 and $5 million, the equivalent of between $20 and $35 million in current values. He had an apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a rent he paid monthly of $800 for a 3-bedroom unit he kept largely empty because he spent most of his time either on the road or in the studio. He was in the process of purchasing a farm property in upstate New York, outside of Woodstock, where he wanted to build a retreat for musicians. He had discussed buying a property in London. He owned multiple guitars, the most valuable of which were the custom-built Stratocasters that he had modified himself. Instruments that today sell at auction for between $2 and $4 million each. He performed at Woodstock in August 1969, headlining a festival that had run over schedule so severely that he went on at 8 in the morning on the last day to an audience that had dwindled from the original 400,000 to perhaps 40,000 people who had not yet left. He played a set of nearly 2 hours. The centerpiece was a performance of the Star-Spangled Banner, played solo on electric guitar, without words, in an interpretation that embedded within the melody of the American national anthem the sounds of bombs dropping, fighter jets strafing, sirens, screaming, the full acoustic vocabulary of the Vietnam War that America was fighting and arguing about with an intensity that made it impossible to hear the anthem the same way again once you had heard what Hendrix did to it. It remains, in the assessment of most serious cultural historians of the period, the single most powerful piece of political art produced by the American counterculture of the 1960s. Jimi Hendrix died on September 18, 1970. in the Samarkand Hotel in Notting Hill, London. He was 27 years old. The official cause of death was asphyxiation following barbiturate intoxication. He had been awake for days, was exhausted, had taken sleeping pills that were not his prescription, in a quantity that was too large for the alcohol already in his system. It was the kind of death that accumulates in increments of exhaustion and chemical dependency, and then arrives suddenly and without ceremony. His girlfriend found him in the morning and called an ambulance. He was declared dead at St. Mary Abbott's Hospital at noon. The business dimensions of what his death created were as complicated and painful as the personal ones. Jimmy had never had control of his publishing rights. His management contracts, signed in the years before he understood what those documents meant, had transferred enormous portions of his future earnings to parties who contributed nothing to their creation. The legal battles over his estate continued for decades after his death. His father Al eventually prevailed in establishing control over the estate through American courts, and the Hendrix family now administers one of the most valuable music catalogs in the world. Conservative estimates place the total revenues generated by Jimi Hendrix's music since his death, across albums, streaming, licensing, merchandise, and related rights, at over $1 billion. He has earned more money dead than he ever earned alive, and he earned a great deal alive. The story of Jimi Hendrix is the story of a left-handed boy in a right-handed world who learned to play by flipping everything over and making the reversal work better than the original. It is the story of a child in potato sack clothes who somehow metabolized that poverty into a creative restlessness that no amount of money ever fully quieted. That night in London in 1966, when Clapton stepped back from the microphone and gave the room to the unknown American, the rock and roll world rearranged its entire understanding of what a guitar could say. That understanding has never fully rearranged itself back. If you want to keep learning about the artists who changed everything, stay with us, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications, because what's coming next is something you won't want to miss.